So your army has fallen, your Space Marines or Xenos lie scattered to the four winds, their objectives are met. Let's talk about 5 of the most common excuses for losing a game of Warhammer 40k, and how much merit there is behind them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we've got a bit more of a discussion video, a little bit about analysing defeats, and the various factors that go into losing a game of 40k. With that in mind, I thought we'd talk through 5 common reasons that people might cite for having lost a game, and perhaps dig into each one a little bit, and how much merit there sometimes is to each one. I think we'd all like it to be purely a question of tactics and strategy, and I think it does enter the equation, but I do think there are really quite a lot of other factors at play besides this. First up, of course, just about everything in 40k happens with a dice roll, so it's maybe not the most uncommon thing ever to blame some very cold rolling for the loss in a game. Certainly if you do have a fair few events that could have gone either way to your opponent, then it could make the difference between victory and defeat. In general, for the majority of games, I do think that dice rolls do tend to balance out somewhat over the course of an entire game, but genuinely in 40k it does occasionally come down to a few really big rolls. Say for example, does your character make his last saving throw and is able to strike back very hard and vanquish the enemy warlord? Or does your last gasp of firepower do quite enough to finish off the last enemy model that was holding down an objective? In general, those moments are things that really could go either way sometimes, and they're often the moments that tend to stick in people's heads most often. Certainly to some extent, dice could genuinely be a factor whether you win or lose, though I think over the course of most games of 40k, you are going to have at least some things that are going to fall favourably for you and favourably for your opponent, and it's often a lot easier to recognise the bad luck in a game that you have rather than the good luck. I feel like it's quite a common anecdote for after the game to say, if I just made one more saving throw, then I could have actually drawn or won the game, or if my model had had quite enough movement to make the advance move to get onto that objective, then again that could have tipped the balance. Funnily enough, that definitely isn't reported quite as commonly by people who win games, I think. I do feel that often, if you think back really objectively over a game about the things that could have gone wrong for you, then unless you put yourself in a whole load of bad situations, in general there's a lot of other points of failure that could happen, but your luck held out for them. For example, the first turn roll-off can be quite a big one. If you look out with your choice of going either first or second, that could be really quite a big swing in your favour that you're not really taking into account for that could have gone the other person's way. And even just getting the unexpected consistent results from your unit could actually be getting really lucky. Say for example, if you've charged 5 units across the course of the game, and they're about 4 out of 5 chance to kill their target each time, if every single one does actually kill their target, then you've actually got fairly lucky there. As you do always have the opportunity to roll very hot or very cold though, that is one of the main skills of playing 40k at a higher level. You're basically managing the risk of a lot of things happening or not happening, and perhaps one of the biggest tactical challenges of the game is trying to stack the odds in your favour, so that in each exchange your odds are to come off better than your opponent's. I definitely do think that a few really bad rolls could certainly be the difference to tip a game that's close, but I do feel that people who feel they're consistently unlucky in every single game that they play are probably either just underestimating the good luck that they've had across the games, or are perhaps just putting their models in situations where they're likely to fail a bit more than they really need to. Another fairly easy excuse, and one that's quite valid in current 40k, is game balance. Some armies just really aren't going to have anywhere near as easy a time as others on the battlefield, and unless you play a mirror matching codexes, it's likely to be at least somewhat of a factor, and sometimes it's going to be a really big factor that's going to make the entire game a really uphill struggle for one person. 40k never has or will ever be perfectly balanced, though I must admit over the past year or so in 9th edition it's rarely been in a particularly good state. We've had armies like Drakari and Admech ruling the roost for a significant amount of months, then they get nerfed, but now we've got a new set of top tier overlords, Talent Custodies at time of recording. I think it certainly depends on exactly what kind of armies that you're playing, for how big of a factor this is going to be. A fair few people, myself included, like to make rough tier lists of 40k armies. If you're playing one of the best armies versus something that's still fairly high up, you might still be having a pretty good game. But if you're playing one of the strongest factions in the game versus one of the weakest, then it's going to be a massive uphill struggle, even if the person playing the weaker army is a lot more experienced and knows how to play the game a bit better. I feel that in 9th edition the vast majority of armies at least have some decent builds. There's enough depth and interesting combos in just about every army so you can put something that's fairly strong on the table, and even the bottom tier armies with a good list and a good general have a pretty reasonable chance of beating even the top tier armies if they're just played by a complete newbie to the game who's just putting models on the table that they like. Still though, that's definitely not going to hold true for 2 people who know roughly what they're doing. At time of recording, if you're playing Chaos Space Marines or Imperial Guard and facing off against a good Tower Custodians player, then you're just going to have a much lower chance of winning the game, probably fairly regardless of whether or not you get some good luck on the dice rolls. Sometimes I feel like it can be a bit of a cop-out to blame game balance. There are really quite a lot of armies that are in with a reasonable shot of beating even the top tier stuff, and I feel like it's maybe a little bit disrespectful to your opponent to say, oh yes, you only won because you're playing one of the cheesy armies. Still though, I think it is worth acknowledging that it is likely to be a factor, even if certainly not the only factor in who wins or loses a game. Kind of going hand in hand with this, I feel that one other reason you could give for losing a game is that your army list is a bit subpar. Even if you are playing a stronger faction, you might not have quite worked out what's the best thing for you to play in it yet, either just your favourite combos of units or what particularly fits with your own playstyle. Sometimes it might just literally be a tactics thing. You've not quite decided on the right combinations of units, and some things that looks good on paper might just not work out so very well in practice. Though it might partly be because you haven't just fielded the absolute top Apex meta list for your faction, because there's other considerations at play. Slavishly following along with the very top list for your faction could take a lot of time, effort, and likely quite a lot of money as well. Games Workshop does like to shift around what's good as often as possible. Also, it might just be a lot more fun to play with things that aren't just the strongest thing for your army. Fun and fluffy options, or just using models that you've painted up and like. Certainly a very valid excuse for using things that aren't the strongest, though in general the more concessions that you make away from the tactically best options, it is going to impact your chance of winning a little bit, even if only slightly. In any case, even if you are taking a bit of a mid-ground, balancing the best tactical combos with which models you have available and the ones that you like to field, in general honing and adapting your army list over time is going to make it gradually better, playing things against new opponents, adapting to the meta and the changing updated codexes, and gradually learning which units are likely to be more effective, or using different playstyles from your army. In any case, that can be one reason that contributes to a defeat. You're using some more fun or fluffy combos of models, haven't got round to painting up the latest meta cheese for the army yet, or just slowly working out your army list, and you think there's some adaptations that you can make to make it better next time. Moving on, even if your dice are rolling hot, and you're playing a strong list of one of the top tier factions, it's still usually going to be possible that you could meet up with a very bad matchup on the other side of the board. In general in 40k, there's a good chance that you're not going to know what you're going to be fighting against, and some factions and army builds just do really counter each other really rather well. It's never a particularly good feeling when you can just look at a game board and realise that this is going to be a massive uphill struggle as soon as you've seen your opponent's army, but occasionally that's certainly possible to happen. Just for a few examples, say if you're playing Imperial Knights, an army that's basically all vehicles, if you run up against an army that's invested almost everything in high power anti-tank weapons, you're generally going to be in for a bad time. I feel that perhaps Blood Angels are fairly well countered by Death Guard armies. -1 damage really does hurt a fair few of their more efficient units like Sanguinary Guard. A lot of the Death Guard melee units will handle Blood Angels elite infantry fairly well, and the fight's last aura from their Blight spawn can be really difficult to approach if you do need to kill them in combat. Perhaps another one might be multiple Catan Necrons versus something like Grey Knights, an army that can deal damage in the shooting, psychic, and assault phase, one where the Catan are going to die far easier than other places. Or perhaps just about any army that relies on quite a lot of fragile light infantry hiding out of line of sight, and then playing against an army like Tau, which have access to loads and loads of cheap anti-infantry fire that it can fire round corners, smart missile systems, or air-bursting fragmentation launchers. Again, I guess to some extent this is a bit of a list building challenge to overcome really. When you're designing an army list, you generally want to think about all the things that you might likely come up against, and making sure that as few armies as possible really have a good chance to just hard counter you then and there. It's kind of about reacting to the meta, whether that happens to be the local people who you might play in your store, or going to a big tournament and knowing that you're going to be playing all the top lists, which ones do well into your army, and which ones you're going to have a fighting chance against. If you only play with 1 or 2 people, then the meta is going to be very, very small, of course. Anything that does well against their armies is likely going to be a lot better than normal. If you are, say, attending a tournament, though, and you've built to counteract some of the best builds, you might still just fall foul of running into an unusual army. Say if you knew that all the top lists will be taking a whole ton of vehicles, so you bring loads of anti-tank to deal with them, and then you wind up drawing against someone who's brought a horde who might not be very likely to win the tournament, but still might have the chance of spoiling people's day who hadn't planned to fight that many infantry. Usually even the best lists in the game will have at least some bad matchups. For example, if you think there's going to be loads of Custodians players about, getting loads of strength 6+ weapons with flat 3 or 4 damage seems like a good shout. It means that you might just be abnormally efficient in that matchup. Still though, drawing up against the wrong army can be a very real excuse for losing a game, even if you're playing with an otherwise good army, good list, and your luck is okay. Finally, and perhaps one of the most easy ones of these to actually improve upon, are tactical errors in game. I guess it's never the best when you realise that you could have done something very different and guided the game to a completely different outcome, but at the same time, if you do recognise it and think about it, maybe there's a better chance that you might spot a similar situation in the future. In 9th edition 40k, I think there's more going on to think about on the table than virtually ever before. Not only are you trying to win the damage game and hopefully gun as much of your opponent's army off the table as possible, but you're also trying to do this while scoring primary objectives and then run around scoring secondary objectives as well. So there's really quite a lot of competing priorities for your units, and how you play them on the table could make for a very, very different game indeed, and maybe snatch victory from a matchup that looked like it was going to be a defeat. I think you can look at 40k tactics in two very different ways, either micro-strategy of individual units fighting each other and scrapping over objectives, or the grand strategy of what your entire army is doing turn on turn to break the enemy and win the game on points overall, both of which are pretty important and often kind of at odds with each other. With micro-strategy for units, it's all about optimizing how much value you get out of every single exchange, say using movement on units to block enemy units, charging them and swinging onto their objectives with the extra movement that you gain, using some guns to the maximum efficiency possible, targeting the right units and not wasting too much firepower while at the same time making sure the important stuff dies. There's really quite a lot of ways that mucking this up could give you some big disadvantages in game. For example, wrapping and trapping enemy units in combats by placing your models all around theirs if possible can be very powerful. You might stop an enemy unit from falling back, therefore allowing you to kill them in their combat phase, or forcing them to pay some CP for desperate breakout. Both of those options are kind of painful for your opponent and will limit opportunities later. Or say if you're in command of your gun line, you either get too greedy and split your fire amongst many different targets, none of which actually die and they all get to strike you back next turn. Or conversely, if you play it too safe, just plow literally all the damage into one enemy unit, that dies, but you've missed the opportunity to deal damage to quite a lot of other units which are all on full functioning for the rest of the game. A lot of it's going to require a fair bit of risk management and often multiple units being involved, but basically missing obvious opportunities or chances to do clever things with your units could lead to a fair few less victory points or the loss of a game overall if something important dies or lives. On the other hand, there's grand strategy, maybe more about the big decisions for your army overall. How are you going to score the points that you need to each turn? Are you going to play really conservatively and preserve the most of your army till later in the game, or go out all guns blazing and just rush and crush the enemy to death? Or are you going to make big efforts to score absolutely maximal secondary objectives or deny the opponent theirs? It genuinely is going to make sense to have different strategies for focusing on different opponents. I feel it might not often be obvious exactly whether or not to play really cagey or go hyper aggressive. Either one could be the right answer against some armies. I think it does take really quite a lot of vision and foresight to be able to think through most of a game in advance and how it's going to play out. Quite apart from tactical decision making though, perhaps more simple errors are just things like unforced mistakes, maybe forgetting that you have certain rules, forgetting to move certain units, forgetting to take them out of reserve at the right time, and all manner of less high-minded mistakes that maybe are a bit more common for most players and not just the top tier tournament people. There's also the depth and insight that come with practicing with a codex for really quite a lot of games. If you know pretty much all of their obscure stratagems off by heart, or what you should do in certain matchups, that's going to be a massive advantage to you. It's definitely going to take a fair few games with any one codex before you really get to grips with a lot of the depth of it, as opposed to someone who's just literally picked up the faction, maybe knows a bunch of the superficial good stuff, but nothing too in-depth. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a little bit of analysis as to some of the factors that might lead you to losing, and of course feel free to blame all of those things next time you lose a game. Always good to combine any of the first four, and then you can still claim to be a paragon of tactical genius even in defeat. I look forward to hearing all your best excuses for losing 40k down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll keep the regular videos coming. I do tend to post 40k things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is what allows me to post quite so many videos quite so often. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, The link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.